Our next session is all about mapping, and Robert says has an excellent panel together for us, and they're going to go through all the mapping topics.
Great, thank you. Good morning. I'm Robert C. I'm with USDA California. This is instinct. I'm not California. I'm in California, but I'm a national office person with the Rural Utility Service. And I will add, let's see, my local note, because I'm a West Lafayette native, and I went to Purdue Ag Econ, and I think Josh at one time asked people to send him something about something that most people wouldn't know. I told him I had 4 dogs, but the actual local piece is, when I was a grad student, I used to broadcast the news on WBAA, the local NPR station, which I've lost that sound, but I used to sound like the NPR announcers because they trained us in that. So I could modulate my voice in the NPR style. You heard about developments in agriculture technology or precision agriculture and the many facets of rural broadband. You heard earlier about the state of Indiana's rural economy, which can be a proxy with localized content of rural economies across the country. In the last year, from federal to state to local to philanthropy, there's been a clear recognition of the importance of broadband. COVID-19 blew up the importance of equitable household broadband access, affecting telemedicine, distance learning to telework. And the need for farm tech access to broadband continues to rise. And you heard that actually just before about that as a barrier. Broadband is no longer a nice to have, but a necessity. You've probably heard that over and over. I will add it's also a public safety necessity. Resources continue to rise for broadband infrastructure, which is a complete change from only 18 months ago. Not since the advent of the interstate highway system in the 1950s has there been such a large commitment of public resources to infrastructure. Broadband is the 21st century digital infrastructure highway. It represents digital transmission in contrast to the 1950s highway infrastructure movement of people and goods. Yet we are still discussing the map for the broadband digital highway. This session is devoted to that. We will have a dialogue on the move of data analytics into mapping for infrastructure deployment and digital equity. So we have this outstanding lineup of 6 panelists. I will briefly introduce them. First, and you heard from him earlier, Roberto Gallardo is director of the Purdue Center for Regional Development and a Purdue Extension Community and Regional Economics Specialist. I think he was introduced earlier, so I won't go through any more. I will say, though, he is the author of a book on the responsive countryside, the digital age, and rural communities, which highlights the 21st century community development model that helps rural communities, which is obviously of interest, and we have talked about it here. Francella Ochillo is executive director of Next Century Cities, a nonprofit composed of over 200 member municipalities across the US that works to expand affordable and reliable high-speed broadband connectivity. We are also going to have a demo, so you have an idea of what's going on visually of broadband infrastructure mapping data analytics. Joining us remotely will be Paul Deming, CEO and co-founder of Geo Partners from Minnesota. And his mission is providing rural America with an accurate broadband map. So he fits in with the theme today. And he's joined by Glenn Fishbein, who's the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder at Geo Partners. His mission is leveraging technology to make things simpler. We all want that. Chris Ali is Associate Professor in the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. You heard from him yesterday. He is an Associate Professor in the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. His research interests include communication policy and regulation, rural broadband, critical political economy, critical geography. I guess I talked about his book yesterday. Currently, Christopher's research projects include examining the role of Virginia counties in broadband deployment, planning, and policy. And finally, Garland McCoy currently serves as co-founder and executive director of the Precision Ag Connectivity Act Stakeholders Alliance. I guess it stands for ARSC. Oh, okay. Okay, it got shortened. Or PAgCASA is the acronym? Okay, that's easier to say, PAgCASA, because it comes out of the mouth easier. And as precision ag needs robust broadband access to function, he has become involved in broadband mapping methodology with standards, crowdsourcing, ground truthing, and sensor data, with open source platforms being key elements of the focus. And I will leave it at that. And then, let's see, we'll start with Roberto.
As Robert was saying, mapping is always a big issue with broadband. The focus right now is availability mostly, but we here at the center have been doing other stuff that really truly look at the equity issue beyond the availability situation. We developed a digital divide index for the nation that goes down to the census tract level. It uses FCC data, so don't shoot the messenger, but it is only a couple of variables. We also included median advertised speeds. We also included census data on device ownership or not having internet at home. But we also included what we call the socioeconomic score, which includes 4 or 5 variables around characteristics that are known to impact adoption, such as age, poverty, disability, and limited English. So we compiled all of those into a single score. As I, and those of you that are out there in rural communities as well, scores are well understood. It's easy to convey the message. So we've been using that digital divide index for a while now, about 5 years, and it is very good at jumpstarting conversations. Now, because it has the FCC data in it, it may tend to overestimate some of the availability data. But in addition to that, we also developed a digital distress metric that also gets at that inequality situation. You saw me present an earlier slide about the very vast differences between urban and rural, but also within urban and also within rural based on income and race. That's also a very big issue that the FCC data is not capturing, okay? And lastly, we also have developed a survey, because as my colleagues will surely discuss, we are looking at availability and accessibility as an inequality issue. But what about adoption and use? The problem with that is we do not have data on that at a consistent fashion across the US. So here in Indiana, we've been doing a lot of surveys, individual surveys, and not to get all boring and academic, but our kind of theory behind it is the digital capital theory that can be added to a community capitals framework. That's what we're using in our center. And we're finding that indeed there are vast differences between groups, especially age. Age is starting to pop up as the #1 predictor of a difference or inequality. So we are looking at or seeing that older folks do not benefit as much as younger folks from the technology. So that's an equality issue right there. I'm moving beyond the accessibility discussion and getting more into the actual use. We are also seeing that low income folks are not benefiting as much as higher income folks. So we're starting to see that offline inequalities do translate into online inequalities and vice versa. And that's really at the crux of the digital capital concept, is how capable are you of translating online benefits into offline benefits and vice versa. So we're exploring all this data, and it is helping us to really drive regional digital inclusion planning, county level digital inclusion planning. And we are finding that beyond the accessibility and availability, which is in and of itself a tremendous, huge issue, we are starting to see also that on the adoption, use, and benefits of the technology, there are also inequalities. So I just wanted to share with you that we are developing these surveys. Unfortunately, again, we don't have access to a national data set, but at the local regional level, it is informing big time, and it is really augmenting what we already are seeing on the accessibility front.
I think one of the interesting things about that index is at the point of having it in this mapping discussion is, aside from the fact that that index, when you look at it on the internet, it is a map you look at, but it is an example of the application of, I call it data analytics, into a public policy sort of sector or analysis to use, because it's an additional guide to help drive things. And so I was wondering, maybe I can toss a question on that, is, do you see any of those things that you've looked at? And you just mentioned a couple of pieces that you don't have data for. Is that something that could be added to the next census, the 2030 census, or actually to the USDA farm census, if we were to do something? Because we have a survey at USDA that literally goes to every farmer in the United States every 5 years. And there is a question on computer usage, but these things, you could add questions, or the Census Bureau has a different American Community Survey questions that go out. Are the missing pieces of data something that could be added to federal surveys, do you think?
I don't know how it was collected last year during COVID, but traditionally when you're finding out what information, like how much access people have to either computing devices, a reliable connection, this is based on a survey that goes to a front door, knocks on the door, and the person has to answer and reply. Now, if you are an at-risk household, you're a low-income household, there are a lot of people who aren't even going to open the door. So the problem is that when we're looking at even 2020 information that's based on a 2019 survey of people knocking on 50,000 doors, only the 50,000 doors that people open doors, and we are making assumptions based on that information. So we need to really start being a little bit more expansive about how we're collecting that information. Where are our points of contact? You know, is it that we need to have that be something formal, that someone knocks at the door? Or maybe if we know that that person gets some sort of other public assistance, maybe when you swipe your SNAP card, I ask you a question in the grocery store. Maybe when you go to the library, I ask you a question when you log on, because we have to meet people in places where it disarms them and they aren't confronted with government that they might not trust. Because especially in households that are not only low-income households, at or below the poverty line, also households where you have immigrants, where especially the parent is where English is a second language. Remember, these people are coming from countries that generally distrust government. So if you are fleeing a country that distrusts government, and then you move into this apartment where someone comes to the front door to ask you information, you're probably not going to give them accurate information. That's if you answered the front door. So I just want to make sure that we're thinking practically, putting ourselves in the shoes of some of the people where we're trying to collect information, because all of the people who are collecting information are the connected, right? So if we are all connected, we need to be able to take off that filter, and be able to see the many obstacles that they face to be able to even participate in a survey.
I'll make one observation, and this is focused back on the mapping aspect, that we do see 4 federal iterations of broadband mapping, 2 at the FCC and 2 at NTIA. And Senator Wicker has weighed in on the accuracy and the up-to-date aspect of federal mapping. So I'm not, you're set up for that. I'm doing the setup. So those are pieces out there. So do you want to come up here, or it doesn't matter?
I can stay here.
Okay.
Sure. So thank you so much. Number one, I just want to say thank you so much just for the opportunity to be people and read a lot. And part of my journey in trying to understand broadband is very often about making sure that I want there to be room for lots of people at the table. people who have not studied this forever, people who are new to the issue, people who are old to the issue. I think it's really important that we make room for new people and new voices. When I travel the country before COVID, I just in my current position, I hit 11 cities in the year and 2 months that I was in my position. And I go to talk to local officials all the time who are constantly grappling with how do we not only come up with broadband solutions, but how do we actually fix the data? The reason why is because for them, data is power, right? Data is what's going to determine whether or not their community gets resources. And it's also going to determine how much resources that community gets. So it's a really important touch point, but we're all aware of the fact that it's very mercurial. So we can't necessarily let perfection be the enemy. Part of what we're looking to do is to make sure that these are living, breathing data sets where we are constantly using them to inform, but being aware of where we need to supplement information. And so our journey started, especially at NCC, when we started to talk to local officials, and this is long before COVID, over and over again, a lot of them really felt hamstrung by poor data. What would very often happen is that places that were either small or mid-sized places that usually sparsely populated would always say, they have us marked as served, but essentially it's just not true and we don't know how to fix it. We know that some local officials and even state officials have on occasion tried to even challenge FCC data sets unsuccessfully. So the problem is that we have this system where, and I should also explain, even in the background, when we think about the evolution of how the FCC has collected data, the FCC historically was not excited about sharing this data publicly, eventually had to share the data publicly, and then has systematically become a little bit more precise in what they're asking people to share. So I want to make sure that we're framing this as this was never something where the FCC was positioned as welcoming in, transparency and let's share information and let's collaborate. That was never what this was. It was essentially in the spirit of transparency. Fine, we'll share it, but we're not gonna put too many restrictions on the people who have a lot of input on how we do what we do. And so the problem that we have now is that a lot of the local and state officials who are responsible for creating data sets are really not the ones with the most leverage at the negotiating table, because very often they are late to the party in saying what information should be collected. So when you get into some of those communities, they're going to tell you very much what, Dr. Gallardo mentioned. I want to know about income and race and other things that play a very specific role in how we assign resources. So when we get to the FCC data, in particular, the Form 477 data, we know that twice a year, if you're a facilities-based provider, yes, you're required to submit that information. And that also will also collect information on wireless connectivity. The problem sometimes that we get, especially when we're talking to local officials, is that they're saying, well, you might advertise it's 25.3, the minimum broadband speeds, but that's not what's showing up in our actual community, in our household connections. So the problem is we have an actual versus a delivered, advertised versus an actual speed issue that very often people are saying over and over, this is problematic in the docket, but it's only recently that the FCC has really acknowledged that issue by even encouraging public input through the speed test. Also, I want to point out that when we are looking at some of the data sets, these things have to be easily usable for people who are not data technicians and computer scientists, because the truth is that a lot of the broadband officers or the people who are in a mayor's office that were appointed to a broadband portfolio don't have a background in computer science and crunching numbers. So the issue is, how are we actually conveying this information in a way that's readily available for public consumption? This is a very technical science in being able to collect, whether it's geospatial data, making assumptions about certain areas. All of those things are important. But when we package the final product, we need to make sure that whether it's academics, whether it's people who are actually local and state officials, that they can actually do something with the data. And once they have that information in their hands, that they can challenge data that is incorrect. One of the things that I did want to point out is just a couple of the highlights that, when we reached out to different community members, specifically when we reached out to people in Montana, They brought up things like it's not only the population barriers, but it's also the physical and the financial barriers in being able to get accurate mapping. And over again, people reached out to the FCC, they reached out to local officials. So essentially it was local officials who banded together to basically collect their own information to correct information at the federal and the state level. Looking at Oregon state officials got together when they were essentially being tired of being locked out of funding opportunities to launch their own state broadband map. And so that's something where they actually created their own platform with broadband services to measure progress and things like that. Georgia, one of the most successful examples, when essentially that was over and over again, even in the metropolitan areas, you might have had accurate data, but in all of those places around it, you have all of these essentially digital deserts. And so I want to make sure in Lexington, Kentucky, that's another great example. I remember one of the meetings we had with the staff there. If you're in Lexington in the center, it's a very affluent, highly connected community. You go out to the edges and everywhere around the county, you essentially fall off the side of the digital earth. So the thing is, it's really important for us to not just talk about these things in the abstract. I give you specific examples because the truth is that when we travel to these countries, they're like, I know you guys do this stuff in DC, but here in my place, whether it's Kankakee, Illinois, Winters, California, I mean, we've been to all sorts of places that actually care about this and they want to be a part of the solution. Some of the things that I do want to point out in terms of, especially when we're talking about policy, and even if we are to improve data, how does that translate into turning into an actual order or policy or direction for either the FCC, the NTIA, and things like that? I think it is important for us to identify who is responsible for collecting data. Because if the FCC is going to be the lead on collecting data, the FCC should also have some sort of obligation to collaborate with other agencies that are working on similar projects. Because it's one thing if, yes, the FCC is collecting Form 477 data and is really, I personally think, making genuine efforts to improve. But there are all of these other sideline projects that are happening in different states. Then there are other things happening in different counties. Then there are other things happening at the local level. And what are we doing to actually use all of those layers to inform what's happening at the FCC? We should actually have somewhere where we're able to collect that information so that if you want to find out what the FCC says about Lexington County, side by side with what Lexington County says about Lexington County. So I think it's really important for us to start asking questions about where are we actually collecting all of this information. And then I also want to make sure that we're talking about what are things that we're getting right and we're getting a little bit closer and a little bit warmer. And that's one thing that brings me to the NTIA broadband availability map. So this year, I do think that the FCC, the NTIA making strides to actually create its broadband availability map with a combination of public and private data. That's a good thing. I honestly think that that's a step forward in terms of our thinking about what data matters. That data is specifically composed of FCC data as one of the layers. You have the American Community Survey data, measurement lab information, UCLA information, and also Microsoft. So you have stakeholders that clearly care about this issue, have deep pockets of expertise, and also I think are forward thinking about how we can consistently get better. One thing that I do want to point out is that when they're doing indicators of broadband need, again, this is when it asks you about the usage, it's talking about 75% or more of the, ACS data where the 25% or more of households report no internet access, 25% or more report no device. Again, when you're using those layers, it is assuming that you actually have spoken to the people who either don't have devices or don't have access. And one thing as a larger point that I want to make sure we're thinking about is when we are talking about people who are disconnected, we are usually only able to estimate with the people who are actually engaged in that dialogue. That is part of the reason why tribal connectivity is so wrong. And part of it is because we're not creating pathways for people that are outside of our orbit to be able to submit input on whether they are disconnected, what are the many ways that we could actually improve it, and how we can actually use their insights to inform our methodologies. So I'll pause there because I know there's going to be a lot of technical information on digging into the pieces. But again, I just offer you guys just as a closing thought to just think about when we are creating these data sets and making conclusions about who is connected, look around that table and figure out, have we been expansive enough about including voices to give input? And very often it is a very homogeneous group of connected people making assumptions about the disconnected.
Thank you. I think, one of the points is in terms of for mapping is that we do need much more granular accuracy in the maps. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. We also need to have maps that are up to date. And that was another issue that came up yesterday. But in terms of for broadband, it's a broadband availability. It's a very dynamic situation so that you have this variability throughout the 24-hour period of what's accessible. You have changes over time as to what's accessible. We will now move on into Geo Partners and the mapping demonstration.
Robert, thank you for all the work that you're doing here and the Purdue team. We want to thank Rush County, Indiana, our pilot. We want to thank Roberto for all the work that he's done, with the folks, the leadership he's provided in Rush County. It's been a tremendous success. Katrina Hall, Randy Cron, Indiana Farm Bureau, and the coalition that they put together along with Scott Rudd in his office. Quick summary, currently we're executing our crowdsourced analytics system in 15 states. We have also activated the full grant analysis, feasibility, and network design components for our states that we have under contract. And I'd like to just say here, Jessica Rosenworcel, acting chairwoman, she makes a statement, you don't manage problems you cannot measure. And lastly, I just want to say, Francella, you are spot on in terms of the data sets. And I want to turn it over to Glenn and take it from there.
All right, I'm going to start with a little story that sort of illustrates the issues of measurement. I'm sure all of you folks paid a lot of attention in 1999 to the Mars Climate Orbiter, which burned up in the Martian atmosphere and cost $193 million as a result. In the diagnosis of it, they discovered that NASA was using a measurement system that uses meters, kilograms, seconds, and Lockheed Martin, their subcontractor, was using feet, pounds, seconds, and the conversion was not being done appropriately. Now, when we talk about things such as RDOF, we have another measurement issue that perhaps is worth a little bit more than $193 million. The issue that we have to grapple with when we're doing any kind of mapping is what are we measuring, what does it mean to do the measurement, and how do we determine errors in measurement? I'm going to go through some of that by example. This is Washington County, Ohio. This is the results of a crowdsourced mapping activity that occurred over a period of about 6 weeks. The individuals were either reporting that they don't have broadband service, or if they did, we were actually capturing their upload and download speeds here. So with this type of measurement technology, and there are many, many, many maps that you can do, but this particular type of mapping allows us to start looking at various issues that are sometimes talked about, but not necessarily measured. So where you see a black dot, that black dot means that that person reported they have no broadband access. Either they can't afford it, it's not available, they don't know how to use a computer, whatever. The green dots are cases where people have better than 25 meg download performance. Red dots are better than 10, are less than 10, yellow dots are better than 10. So we have a very simple picture showing here that these areas up in here, these are well-performing areas, and areas such as this are not so well-performing. So the first question I want to ask is, okay, so this is obviously an availability map. We've solved the problem from the FCC's point of view as to what's available and what's not. But if we happen to zoom into this particular community called Lowell, what we see is a bunch of green dots and black dots. Now we take a look at the green dot and we can see that's Charter Communications coming at 114 megabit per second download. Move over to this one, it's 71 megabits per second download. This one here is 77 megabit per second download. Clearly, Charter Communications is available. But every one of these black dots here, these people do not have broadband. So it's available, but it's not necessarily affordable. And if we look at the affordability issue, we see some user reports which tell us that that charter download speed of 114 megabits per second costs them $65 a month. So immediately, this type of mapping can start pointing us towards what we would think of as digital inequity. And that inequity in this particular case is going to translate into affordability. So affordability becomes one of the dimensions that we can think of that we can derive from this kind of mapping. And oh, by the way, this is extremely at the household level. These are the rooftop views as to where these locations are. That person lives in that house, that person lives in that house. So we have rooftop scaling for this type of thing. Now, another thing we can look at as we're looking at this scale is we can also start looking at this in terms of the FCC 477 data by comparison. So bringing in a different view of this, we're going to take a look at the FCC 477 content compared to the speed test content. Now what you're seeing is a view of the census blocks at which the 477 data is presented. And over in this box here, what you're going to basically be seeing is speed test information that we've captured versus the FCC 477 data that's been reported. So if we move into this particular census block, we see that Charter Communications has reported to the FCC that they have 940 meg advertised download. That's fantastic. If we look at the speed test data, we see 22 reports of no service and 4 reports of Frontier Communication averaging 4 meg down. There are 31 households in this location. We've sampled 26 out of 31. We're at a 95% confidence interval statistically at a plus or minus 25% error measurement. We would claim that 19 out of 20 times, based on statistics, that our data is right. And 1 in 20 times we're going to be wrong. But now what we can basically talk about in terms of measurement theory is the error of the measurement as well. So that's one of the principles that we can start achieving as we go to this type of data collection process, is we can talk about the error that is always going to be there, but now we can measure it. Move into this census block by example. Here we're seeing Charter Communications again reporting the FCC 940 meg down. Well, here we've got 24 reports of no service. We have 3 reports of Frontier Communication averaging 2 megabits per second, and lo and behold, Verizon Wireless, 2 reports at 16 meg down. And we take a look at this nice little green dot here, and that is Verizon Wireless doing a 26 meg download, no Charter. And our confidence level again is above 95%, in this case, plus or minus 5% error range. So what we're basically being able to do from this measurement approach is talk about the quality of the data, the reliability of the data, and the significance of the data. And that's something that is relatively unseen in any of the other measurement approaches that are done. Now, another thing we can do when we start looking at this kind of data collection process is we can also start looking at different types of broadband issues. Here we're looking at availability in terms of download. Now we're looking at the upload. And now we're looking at the quality of the transport system. This is the ping time between these households and the rest of the internet. Each one of those black dots is indicating a routing problem. The ISP itself is not directly connected to any good quality backbone. Those are in excess of 200 millisecond ping times. So if we're looking at funding issues, we might also want to look at the infrastructure issues that are preventing those ISPs from getting a reliable high-speed connection with low latency into the broadband. Because even if these people have a high-speed connection, they're having low quality performance. Another thing we can look at from this type of measurement system is what we think of in terms of jitter. This is a measurement of how much noise is on the line. Again, each of those black dots that you see has an extremely high jitter measurement. What that means is even if you have a good quality performance at your circuit level, the number of packets that have to be retransmitted is exceptionally high. This is probably indicative of things such as old DSL copper that's being corroded, is turning from copper color to green. And that's a different type of infrastructure issue that has to be resolved in terms of your funding approaches. And then we can take a look at the costs overall, because people will often report their costs when they take this type of testing from what we do. And we can now start looking at how much does it cost per month. And as we see, as you're in high density areas, your costs are low. As you go out into the boonies, your costs start going up and your quality of service drops. So this type of measurement technology, the type of system that we're looking at in this mode, allows us from a single measurement to look at multiple different aspects of broadband connectivity and broadband problems. Given that we have that, now the next question will be, well, what are we going to do about it? It's a pretty map. I like it. You like it. It's very dynamic. But you can't do a darn thing unless you can actually solve the problem. So we take the next step and try to figure out how much is it going to cost to solve the problem. So one of the things we can overlay is the available fiber networking that goes into there. Now we've got two areas that are very interesting. This area up in here has a lot of no service. This area up in here has a lot of no service. If we're going to put a project into this area, we can see we've got backhaul readily available. If we're going to go into this area, the backhaul's way the heck up here. So the first question we have to ask is, how much is it going to cost to get the backhaul from here, where we have it, to here, where we want our project to be? So from an analytics point of view, the first question we can ask is, how much is it going to cost me to get some sort of broadband to the project area? So we can answer that in terms of looking at how many road miles are there going to be to get from where we want, where we have it, to where we want it. And we can see that it's 3.7 road miles of the possibility of doing a point-to-point fixed wireless solution in here. This red line basically indicates that we've got a hill problem. We've got the endpoint tower here at 80-foot elevation, got the starting point here at 80-foot elevation, but there's a hill in the way. And there's the terrain characteristics that go along with that. We're going to have to put a third tower in there if we're going to do point-to-point. Now, if we're paying $100,000 a mile for the fiber, that's a $370,000 fiber solution. If we're paying $35,000 per tower, that's a lot less. And so we can use this to think in terms of the cost of just getting the backhaul into the region. All right, now that we know how much the backhaul is going to cost, now how much is it going to cost to put a broadband network into this area? So what we can do is we can arbitrarily define a region of interest and say, okay, let's figure out how much it's going to cost to put the network in there. So we define the area just by drawing lines around it. And now we give it a name. And now we have to have a couple of critical factors. What is our blended cost per mile of fiber? That's the aerial, trenched, and bored. And that's something that we can find out from local providers or local utility companies. And then we go into this interesting exercise. We can select 100% fixed wireless, 100% fiber, or a hybrid design. I'm going to start off and say we're going to do 100% fiber to the home for this particular area. The parameters here we'll discuss some other time, but what I basically told the system to do is give me a fiber to the home solution and tell me how much it's going to cost. So with that type of context, now we have the area defined, the map told us where to look, and now we have got 100% coverage. The networking cost for installing that fiber using standard fiber technologies, Calyx networking equipment, fully burdened is going to be a $4.7 million project. And in terms of its grant competitiveness, it's going to be pretty low. We only going to have 4 points. Basic information on that is sitting back here, and we can see the cost of the fiber, the electronics, total net fully burdened project cost. Our cost per household for doing that is going to be $16,000. Well, that's sticker shock time. Let's try something else. So let's go back, and we can very simply recreate the area by pressing the equal sign. Now what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, let's forget the fiber. Let's make this a fixed wireless solution. So I'm driving the system to be a fixed wireless solution. So we can work, say, in terms of the old 25-3 model, or 120, or 100-100 symmetric. Each of these are going to pull in a different type of cost modeling depending upon the technology for the fixed wireless solution. And now we're going to figure out how much does it cost to do a fixed wireless project in the area. Well, if you look at the terrain, it's pretty sucky. There's going to be a lot of houses and valleys, and we'll get about 69% of those houses instead of 100%. But instead of $4 million, we're going to spend $128,000. That's a good starter package. Maybe even the state itself can afford to do that. But maybe we can do something better. Why don't we try to do a hybrid network instead? A mixture of fiber and fixed wireless. So now we can come back in here and we can basically ask ourselves, okay, if I did a mixture of fiber and fixed wireless, which is the default setting of this, how well will that perform? So we can take the defaults over here, which are preset to that type of structure, and take a look at what the cost might be. So in this case, what it say, I can get myself up to a 78% coverage rate at a cost of $717,000. I look at my parameters down here. My per household cost is $3,200. That's probably a fundable project. It's not terribly competitive in terms of other possible granted scenarios, but it's a project that we can probably afford to do. And once we get that fiber started, we can expand it in subsequent years. So the idea isn't that we have a pretty map, which we definitely have a pretty map. The idea is that now we can move to the next step and we can help somebody figure out, do I want to do a grant application in this project area or not? Now, every one of these models I just ran gets popped into a database that can be extracted into an Excel spreadsheet. So as I start doing is, like the state of Washington has been running over 100 of these in the last couple of weeks in anticipation of that big glut of money, they can now sort through all the project areas they might want to consider, and then they can find out, cost per household, educational impact, because we have that data, whether or not there are opportunity zoning values in there, and all that. And they can target the hypothetical projects to the specific grants that are available at this time. And once you do that, then you can start having a sense for what I can actually spend time trying to get money for. And one other minor thing we can do with this type of data is we can actually start tracking changes over time. So if I'm a state agency and I have my own state grants, I might want to know how my money is being spent. So from that context, what I can do is I can start looking at changes over time. So what I'm looking at right now is how things are changing for each ISP over time. And if I'm putting money into this environment, and let's say I'm giving it to charter, what I should be seeing over time is that the change in performance should be improving. And if it is improving, they're doing a great job. If it's not changing, they haven't started yet, might want to find out why. If it's going down, now you really have to ask, what are they spending their money on? So this permits you also start auditing the programs that you have in the field and get a sense for whether or not that money is being spent, when it is being spent, and is it being spent in the manner that you anticipated. In other words, you can now audit the implementation of deployments throughout the whole process. All this comes from one particular measurement strategy. It's not the best, it's not the worst, it's a measurement system. It has its pros and cons like any measurement system. It's not necessarily the maximum advertised download speed. It's not necessarily the maximum circuit capacity, but what its limitations are can be known. It has a statistical validity and it permits different questions to be answered in a very rapid manner. So the point that we're trying to make here is we don't necessarily have the answer for all possible mapping, but by choosing your measurement system correctly, you're not going to collide with the atmosphere of Mars and burn up $193 million. You're not going to put RDOF money into areas that have already been overbuilt. You are going to have a good sense in real time as to what's happening in a region. The map updates itself every time somebody takes a speed test within a few milliseconds, and you can start tracking potential projects and deployments in real time. So that's essentially what we do, and that's why we think measurement theory is very important to the processes that go into broadband measurement.
Oh, I have a question to add in terms of, you've shown a map with, we've talked about the importance of granularity for broadband mapping. And this map does show these are households there as opposed to a block. And I think what this shows us that we have technology that allows us to be very specific and look at things on a household basis as opposed to looking at a block basis, which has its whole set of criticism. And I can understand why the blocks were used in terms of the limitation of data one had, and this is, you use that. I know on the marketing side, in terms of, this is not broadband, but for businesses, they will use census blocks or zip codes. They look at a block and they make their decisions based on data accumulated for that block, making an assumption the whole block fits that. But This shows you have the granularity per household. So should we abandon the block approach if we can get that kind of granularity?
Yeah, no, just as an aside, we're using MLab as a platform. We like that for a lot of different reasons. It's another 40-minute discussion as to why. But MLab is a public domain, public sourced speed test measurement system that has been on the planet for the last 10 years. Should we abandon the block? Well, the block is as useful as the fabric. I don't think of myself living on the census block, and I don't think of myself living on a fabric. I live in a house, and I need my internet. So I want a very personalized approach to my broadband. So I would say any arbitrary geographical area other than that defined by money, what am I going to fund within the area, it should be focused on the region of problem. Ignore the block, ignore the tract, focus on the house, because that's where the people are.
I have a slightly related question on this in terms of, I mean, you're showing the granularity of the households on that map, but then aren't there households that don't show up on that map because we have no data for it? And is that
yes,
that earlier
absolutely.
discussion about crowdsourcing as a means to, I call it the hole, to fill in the holes?
There's two aspects to that. First of all, when you choose a measurement system, whatever it is, fabric, block, crowdsourced, it's got an error range. You're guaranteed to have an error created anytime you do a measurement. What we try to do is we try to make the errors fall below the noise floor. That's why we do the statistical modeling that we do. So it's sort of like sampling in a survey. You're not going to survey 100% of the people, but you're going to survey enough to get a good estimate with an error bound as to how accurate your measurements are. So in that context, yes, there are going to be holes. You can fill them in later if you don't have enough samples, and get to the point where you have a good statistical confidence that you have a good picture of what's really happening on the ground. And you know, given the error rates that are occurring with this type of measurement system, how much confidence you should have in the data that you've collected. And if you don't have a lot of confidence, then yeah, go back, collect more data, fill in the holes.
Well, I think that short discussion about the filling in the holes and crowdsourcing is, and thank you very much for this presentation. I think the visual part was important so you could actually see the granularity that can be achieved. And I think then this is a natural flow to Chris Ali, who will come up. I guess, do you want to come up? Yeah, you have slides. And he's going to talk about, I think, what you're doing on a more local level.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm going to share some work we've been doing over the last 6 months with Virginia counties. And by we, I mean me and my two fabulous research assistants. I've already introduced myself. Just a shameless plug to ask you all to buy my new book, which comes out on September 21st, called Farm Fresh Broadband, The Politics of Rural Connectivity. And that's with MIT Press. Again, what I'm talking about, what we're investigating, is the role that counties play in broadband deployment policies and planning in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I'm gonna skip some. We all know what COVID has demonstrated with broadband, and we know the statistics in broadband. But what the other thing is, there is a tremendous amount of money that is about to come down the pipes. This has included, obviously, RDOF, which is already underway, the $24 billion program. Some CARES Act money, Consolidated Appropriations money, American Rescue Plan Act money, and now most recently discussion of $65 billion, or which I've just read has been reduced to $40 billion for broadband infrastructure. Tremendous amount of money. We've also seen some amazing work coming out of the Pew Foundation about the importance of states in broadband deployment and policy. Also a fabulous paper written by Whitaker and Gallardo about the importance of state broadband offices, funding, stakeholder engagement, planning, capacity building, program evaluation. We also know that municipalities are crucial to this conversation, right? And this is a great quote from Susan Crawford's book. It turns out that America's awful, expensive data connectivity is a national problem for which the solution is intensively local. Cities and localities are leading the way. So we've got these two things in mind. We've got the importance of states and we've got the importance of municipalities. We were wondering, what about counties? Right, so what is the role that counties play in broadband planning, policy, and deployment, particularly in the state of the Commonwealth of Virginia? Where does broadband rank amongst the policy priorities of Virginia counties? What is the state of broadband planning amongst Virginia counties? And what obstacles do Virginia counties face when actualizing their broadband plans? Little bit of insight into broadband deployment in Virginia. According to the FCC, Virginia is 83.4% served at 25.3. 697,000 Virginians do not have access to a wired connection at 25.3. 306,000 Virginians do not have access to any form of wired internet. Virginia ranks 15th among states in broadband connectivity. We do have an Office of Broadband Assistance, staffed by two fabulous, although overworked human beings. In 2020, the state offered $19 million in grants through the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative, which is known as the VATI program. And then another $8 million was offered through the Tobacco Commission's broadband program. And there's a great interface called Commonwealth Connect, and they've got a community broadband toolkit that can be used as well. Most recently, as of just 6 days ago, Governor Northam announced a $700 million plan for broadband by 2024. This money is not coming from state coffers, but rather coming from the stimulus package, the $4 billion that Virginia got through this recent stimulus package. $700 million will go to broadband deployment. So again, we're talking about a colossal amount of money and potential for money in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And we became quite interested in the role of counties. And to better understand this, we launched a survey, kind of my first, at least, serious attempt at survey construction. I'm not a survey methodologist at all, but we developed a 30-minute survey using the Qualtrics platform. We sent it to all 95 county administrators. And just an important point here, in Virginia, independent cities are, well, independent of counties. So there are 38 independent cities in the Commonwealth, 95 counties. We specifically wanted to hear from counties because, well, they're the ones who get left out of the conversation. So we sent it to county administrators. For counties that did not reply, we sent it to their broadband authorities. If they didn't have broadband authorities, we sent it to IT directors or economic development directors. Our survey was consistent with Pew Charitable Trust surveys and was reviewed by members of the Virginia Governor's Broadband Advisory Team. So we currently have data for 42 out of the 95 counties. Not a great response rate, 44%, but trying to get county administrators to fill out a survey is difficult to say the least, but we're working on it. It's still in the field right now. So if there are any county administrators in Virginia listening to this right now, please fill out my survey. What I want to report today are our 4 major findings from what the data that we have collected thus far, and we're working on a white paper to kind of explore these in more detail. So those would be funding, mapping, partnerships, and urban bias and rural neglect. At the funding finding, there's a lot of money already being spent by Virginia counties. Even the least populated counties, for instance, Caroline County, population 30,000, Caroline County spent $605,000 last year on broadband. Most of this money, and this was surprising to us, most of the money that counties are spending are coming from their regular tax base. They're not creating a special tax district. They're not using bonds in the Commonwealth of Virginia. They're relying on regular taxes, which means, of course, the more people in the county, the more money that can be spent. Virginia, like I said, has upped its state commitment. Of course, I wrote that line before $700 million was announced. So they've really upped. They're now the leader in broadband money, outpacing even Illinois and New York State. Lots of counties have applied for and won a variety of federal and state grants for broadband, and many use CARES Act funding for broadband deployment. I want to point out here, I know no one can read this, but Nelson County here. Nelson County received $2.6 million from the CARES Act and spent $1.5 million, or 59% of its CARES Act funding was spent on broadband. And the reason why I want to highlight Nelson County is that by 2023, Nelson will have 100% fiber pass to the home for all of its residents. They have been at the forefront. They will become the most connected county in the state of Virginia. The other really cool thing that Virginia did, and which counties availed themselves of, was that Virginia allocated $30 million to create a FastTrack broadband grant program. 47 counties participated in this, and this was a no strings attached provision. You just had to apply for the money. Generally, you got it. And what Stafford County reported to us is the county successfully received $525,000 in CARES Act FastTrack broadband funding. These have been a tremendous help in the western and eastern parts of the county to reach unserved residents. So a really innovative way in which Virginia was parlaying CARES Act money into FastTrack deployment. Now to the sexy part about mapping, the topic of our panel. We ask counties to self-report broadband deployment at 25/3, 50, 10, and 120. When we designed the survey, we did not have access to any data sets. And so we were just curious, what were county administrators going to tell us about broadband? Our findings confirm the findings of others that we all know, that the level of connectivity is heavily overcounted by the FCC. In Madison County, for instance, there was a 90% discrepancy between the FCC's data and the country's data. The FCC reports Madison is 100% served with 3 providers. Madison reports that they are in fact 10% served. So this is, I'm not sure how, oh, this is pretty legible here. The darker the red, the more the discrepancy between county administrators reported, self-reported deployment and the FCC. Now, the other thing we could be asking ourselves is self-reported data reliable? Like I said, our data is consistent with studies performed by US Telecom and by data released by Microsoft on GitHub that demonstrates the lack of connectivity in Virginia, especially south of Northern Virginia, or called Nova, and west of Hampton Roads. Hampton Roads is on the eastern shore of Virginia. We also partnered with Lightbox, who participated in the Georgia State Broadband Map to verify our data. Lightbox provided combined fixed mobile Wi-Fi derived data at the county level. Now, because there were so few data points to work with, Lightbox data was not divided by speeds. We just kind of had this amazing bulk data set from Lightbox. The country reporting often, but not always, fell between kind of what Microsoft was saying and what Lightbox was saying. So we're adding basically 2 data sets to this kind of picture that we're all painting: FCC data, Microsoft data, Lightbox data, and now county data. And this data was just recently added. So we're still working on trying to figure out the significance of what I'm showing here. So that's our next step, and be prepared for an article in the next few weeks on that. The massive amount of discrepancy between broadband deployment in Virginia is noted by counties, right? So we're actually seeing, when in the qualitative answers to our questions, quite a lot of hostility between rural counties and urban counties, as you can imagine. I just want to read a quote here. The General Assembly money committees believe that car lane miles in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads are more important than meeting greater needs of the entire Commonwealth. Most importantly, educated facilities and broadband. Until urban legislators change their attitudes towards rural Virginia, broadband access funding is unlikely to ever be a priority. So strong, harsh words from Wythe County that was echoed by a number of the least densely populated, much more urban counties. So we're seeing quite a lot of tension here between counties that are perceived to have been slighted by legislators coming out of Richmond, Nova, and then the Hampton Roads area. Am I running out of time? No? Okay, good. All right. I also want to talk about partnerships. Almost every county had a partnership with an internet service provider and or commented on the importance of partnerships. Lots were partnering with electric cooperatives, such as CVEC, which is a Central Virginia electric cooperative out of Nelson County. They have a program called Firefly, and just recently Firefly announced it was going to partner with 5 additional counties to deploy fiber to the home. There was also some really interesting disagreement as to the benefits of partnering with investor or shareholder-owned ISPs like Comcast versus, specifically trying to seek out an electric cooperative. I'm not going to read all of this, but Culpeper, for instance, Culpeper County was quite comfortable partnering with whatever ISP would partner with them. They in fact said, you know what, we're not even going to draw up a broadband plan. we're going to let Comcast do it for us. Prince William County told us that the FCC needs to stop protecting the telecom lobby. So again, disagreement on who is counted as a viable partner for counties. Only one county reported that they cannot at all find a private ISP partner. And this is significant because in Virginia, in order to win a Virginia state grant, you have to have a private partner. Counties cannot do it on their own without special discomposition. So again, many counties pointed to the potential partnerships among to attract ISPs. One county actually suggested passing legislation to require electric cooperatives to justify why they aren't offering retail broadband, which is kind of interesting suggestion, right? So a lot of emphasis here on electric cooperatives to fill in the connectivity gaps left by private providers. And I want to echo what Francella was saying, is that what our research was really demonstrating is that counties need to be brought to the table, but that we need to meet counties where they are in the field rather than legislate from DC or Richmond or Nova or Hampton Roads, right? So for researchers in particular, we need to meet these communities where they are. And I just love the idea of, you know, there's still a lot of work to do, right? That was one of the major takeaways from our work. You know, a couple of suggestions that we had, obviously expand the Virginia Broadband Office, devote more state funds. Again, that was written before the $700 million announcement. Potentially revise the grant system to be based on need rather than beauty pageant applications. This was especially true with the Virginia CARES Act FastTrack Broadband Grant Program. Revise the VATI program to fund counties even if they can't find a private partner. A lot of counties said we would try and do this on our own. In Virginia, it is very difficult for counties and municipalities to fund broadband networks without a private partner. Difficult in the legislative sense. The state of Virginia has made it difficult for municipalities and counties to form their own networks. Obviously, we got to improve mapping, you know, and potentially, you know, look at Georgia's partnership with Lightbox as a great example to improve mapping in the Commonwealth of Virginia. All right, thank you very much, everybody.
My name is Garland McCoy. I'm with PAgCASA. It's Precision Ag Connectivity and Accuracy Stakeholder Alliance. I want to, before I go quickly through the PowerPoint here, I want to thank Purdue for hosting this, particularly recognize the president, Mitch Daniels, worked with and who stood up the think tank I worked with for 15 years, the Progress and Freedom Foundation. It was the first fall of 1994 as the first sort of digital Washington think tank, along with Jerry Berman, John Perry Barlow's writer for the Grateful Dead. He stood up the well, and then after that you had the Electronic Freedom Foundation with Jerry Berman. Anyway, but they were both out in the West Coast. We sort of had this up in Washington, and Mitch Daniels was very influential in helping put that together with Jay Keyworth, who's National Science Advisor with Reagan. And I met most of my two colleagues actually through the Progress and Freedom Foundation, because we had an Aspen Summit every year at the St. Regis there in Aspen, Colorado. And I met my first colleague. So let's go up here. Peter Harder, who's an early hire at Netscape. So just after Mozilla, then Netscape came along and they hired Peter as a patent attorney. I got to know him real well, and he and I joined up on this because, like a lot of the guys in the early commercialization of the internet, he now has a vineyard with his wife and has all the challenges of rural connectivity. He was also very early on ISP, helped start up a lot of ISP companies. He's with me. The other partner is Ed Engel, was with Microsoft, just retired from there for forever, out of their Washington office, and he worked a lot on their broadband suite, their white spaces, airband, and then also on their farming applications, FarmBeat. So they're both with me, and we just got started on this because we particularly focused on precision ag. But as we started looking at this, it became obvious quite early on that we needed to really look at the broadband access issue, because that was the thing that was really holding everything back. I also want to, before I get really going on this, thank Robert for inviting me here, and also Dennis Buckmaster, whose early work sort of got me on the right track here. So, all right, so got the introductions done. The flashpoint also on this was a local initiative there in Oregon at Polk County, Oregon, where Peter Harder has his vineyard. And they did this in July of 2019, really got some good responses back, but it gave all of us a clear indication of how bad the Form 477 data program was as a result of the replies back on that. So that got us realizing, there was a big problem, and having that sort of validated with that Polk County, we started really looking further afield. And looking at if you step back for a minute, if you look at what we're facing right now, this really is one of those bipartisan grassroots thing where it's been building for at least a decade now, where you had citizens all across America coming to the local politicians' district meetings and really being upset about it, saying, look, I don't know what the FCC says or what my carrier says. I'm not getting anything, or I'm getting subpar or what have you. They were very upset. This then led to congressional hearings, a lot of constituent witnesses giving validation to all of this, and which led to March of last year, the passing of the Broadband Data Act with 70 co-sponsors. So clearly an example of both political parties coming together and getting behind something. So now that bill, which is now law, was to be the law on which the FCC was to look to reform their Form 477 data gathering process. So, but that's always a challenge, taking legislation and moving into regulation. So although I'm quite hard on the FCC, they do have some challenges ahead of them in that process. So anyway, in our learning curve on all this area, we gave presentations to the USDA. We filed with the FCC in the fall. They're on their rulemakings. We've done presentations before the Precision Ag Connectivity Task Force on their mapping. I've gotten quite close with a lot of the people on the Precision Ag Connectivity Task Force. We've presented a people-centered, future-focused sensor and broadband mapping paper, which has gotten quite a bit of attention, and we've distributed that very broadly for vetting out with the stakeholders communities here. Again, we've really focused in both on our filings and interaction with the FCC, with the other agencies, and also paid quite a bit of attention to the language of the Broadband Data Act. So while acknowledging again the challenge of turning legislation into regulation. So I wanted to again quickly go through all the stuff you'll find at the very end, because of our we've got a website now. If you go to www.PAgCASA, it's PAgCASA.org, and you particularly hit the tech link, you'll see our FCC filings, and most particularly on there, you will see our latest missive to the FCC, which is in the form of an ex parte letter and one-page methodology. Now that one-page methodology came out of a meeting we had with the chair of the FCC's Broadband Data Task Force, Jean Cadeau, who we got invited to make a presentation with her and her staff. They really liked what we were talking about in terms of the third-party validation, data gathering, and challenge standardized initiative that we were discussing. And so they asked us to write it up and submit it with ex parte, which we did. We'll have that at the very end of the presentation here. So again, when we met with Gene Purdue, we sort of spelled out a standardized methodology for third-party crowdsourcing that could work, that would be from, all 50 states, coast to coast, border to border, that would go to the real part that's lacking in the thing, which is this third-party data, which the challenge, unfortunately, the challenge process has been successfully executed to keep the third-party data out up until, and we hope that's the part that really gets reformed here. That will help bring in the consumers, bring in the test data in such a way that will pass the challenge process. And this is going to require something more than what's been done before, which is basically M2M, machine to machine data that's come in. Helping the people execute the tests and making sure that the data that validates that test is brought forward for the challenge process is what's critically important. All right. So again, if you go to our page, you'll see the technical information and the links there to all of our FCC filings, our filings, then our reply comments, and I think actually we did on your thing as well on the fabric part of it. There are all these technical parts that you have to work your way through, and then most particularly the ex parte and the one-page methodology. So what's the critical part of all this? What has to happen? I'm a big believer in standards. I'm a big open source guy because I love Vince Cerf and Bob, and I was part of them, and I've had them up doing testimony and stuff like that, had working dinners with them on issues and stuff. And but I don't care who you are, whether it's M Labs, Oakland, whatever. It's all back. It's got back doors there. There's a lot of stuff that the proprietary guys have that's absolutely beautiful and it's great. And I know the guys, Deming and the others. But you really do want something that's open source, and there are some open source tools in this area that aren't bad. So what we want to do is we want to really have a situation where we're able to reach out, recruit, reach out and help, both in the test and most particularly, and you'll see this in the letter that Senator Wicker just sent as a critique of the NTIA's recent released interactive maps that were discussed here. That you really have to focus in on, all right, what's the machine doing during the time of the test? Has the server had the active Wi-Fi disabled, so it's not engaged in other work that would affect the test? Is it engaged in any kind of software update or patching, whatever? You want in effect a still server when you take the test. It's not engaged in any other activity. It's active Wi-Fi disabled, and we can help the customer do all that and take pictures that validate it through and this also is going to be captured on a website. This the website being built on open source software that will collect and have it transparent and data interoperability. Again, all this is built on the language of the Broadband Data Act. We've built this platform specific to that. So again, data interoperability, transparency, and also for the challenge, everything is there, all the documentation. So you want to ensure that you're helping the customer capture the data, videotaping the actual disabling of the Wi-Fi and the current state of the server during the test, bringing the data forward. And what's also important here, and this is where I agree with the ISP providers as part of the challenge process, you want to make sure that the individual that's doing the test has bought the highest service provided by their service provider. So they're at the top tier, and so you know that this test is being taken at the premium or optimum level when it's being recorded. So we also need, and we can redact the actual bill such that we're keeping the privacy information. We'll keep that, but the bill that will be shown, that'll be documented as far as the data that comes in, will document the fact that they're getting the premium service, the top tier service from whatever the service provider is. So that goes along and ensures that the challenge process doesn't knock out this data. That's been the problem. The problem has been the map is entirely almost to a data point comprised of the data coming in from the service providers. It hasn't been ground truth, if you will. Ground truthing is very important. This third-party data, this granular third-party data is going to be extraordinarily important, not only to validate it right now, but going forward. We're going to keep coming back to these individuals because we're going to establish a relationship with them. And we'll ask them to do this with our help, live chat, or actually on the phone. We're going to set the system up where they're really going to be helped down, so that they're able to be sort of benchmarking this thing, and we can see progress by virtue of coming back to them and asking them to do periodic tests throughout the year. All of it, again, standardized. All these kits, the soup to nuts thing, platform, the whole thing for this nationwide approach. That isn't to say they won't have lots of opportunities for the folks, Deming and his group and others, but to work on specific states for specific grants coming out of other agencies. But for the FCC one, now why is all this important? Why is the FCC map so important? Because it's going to be the lodestone. Excuse me. It's going to be the lodestone or the guidepost for what is hoped to be a tremendous amount in the 60s, 80 billion, $100 billion commitment. Most of it going to rural America for the broadband infrastructure, and so it's going to be extremely important to have these maps updated as quickly as possible and as granular as possible to help guide the funding. Make sure it's not you don't have overbuilding and these sort of issues don't come up that's often plagued this. Now here's the July 8th letter from Senator Wicker, who was his bill, the Broadband Data Act, along with and he got 70 of his colleagues there, 69 of his colleagues there in on this. And if you look, so that's number 10. If you look at 11, particularly at the sentence that precedes the number 4-foot mark, it says finally, the speed test usage data can be affected by a number of variables, including the end user's equipment. So again, we're looking at we've really looked at all of this, all the paper, thousands of pages that have come in from the service providers, et cetera, on this to fashion this document. So what's the end game? All right, the end game is we want a lot of third-party data to come into this thing that will pass the challenge process and will make its way in and be a permanent part of it. This is going to be a living platform that's going to be updated all the time, and as new citizens are recruited and brought into this, and as the old ones are gone back to continue to update, do tests for us. We want to look also at beginning to do what we set out to do at the beginning of this, was start to look at sensors. Look, the potential change agent here. All right. The problem with the rural area is it's not a marketplace. That's why you have to pour in billions and billions of dollars of universal service fund and other grants to sort of help prop it up, right? There's not enough demand. Now, how are you going to get demand? Well, our farming family is going to go back to having 8 or 10 kids? Probably not. Are we going to have a big rush from urban areas to suburban areas? Probably not. But you may end up very quickly having not millions, not billions, but literally hundreds and hundreds of billions of sensors out there. Used by all manner of the farming business writ large, whether it's land for cattle, forest management, environmental areas, huge environment. Remember, the environmental storm that hit, all right, that began the whole environmental issue that is with us, that is a very bipartisan concern here in this country, was Silent Spring, DDT, right? Farmers, DDT. And the second one was the horrific situation faced by the Chesapeake Bay, the fishermen there, which is right next to Washington, that caused such a stir because of the death blooms that were going there, which was the runoff of the nitrates, the fertilizer, which was gobbling up the oxygen and killing off the crabs and the fish and everything. It was those two together was sitting right on the plate of Nixon, who, as this thing all got rolling. So coming back and treating those areas, looking at carbon capture and starting to benchmark that. These are all sensor issues. This is all where sensors can come into play. Huge, huge positive impact for the farmer, consumer, and also for the environment. So we want to start including broadband demand, broadband networks, both in licensed and unlicensed. We want to start capturing that. We want to bring machines in that are beyond just simply unlocked smartphones, where you're going to pick up the license, but only 2 of the unlicensed band with an unlocked smartphone. Want to put in equipment like think RF, or maybe if we can get it tweaked a little bit, Hailstorm or Stingray with a court order, but begin to get all the spectrum. So we see what we begin for the first time ever. We've never really even had an inventory of what's out there, wire and wireless. So we know what we've got. We can start benchmarking all this. So, all right. So we're going to, hold on. I'm wrapping it up. Why won't it move to the last 2 pages here? I'm trying to get the last 2 pages on my, sorry. Why is it not? Because I want to get the last 2 real quick here. And then I'm finished. Thank you. Is it just, I'm not, whoops. All right. So that's me. That's the website here, PAgCASA. And then this one doesn't have the last 3 pieces. Okay. On the one that I will have up there for everybody to see, I've got a screenshot of the FCC. This is important. They just announced the broadband data task force headed up by Gene Purdue has just made a request, which will be in the Federal Registry for on the mobile data capture on the third party on a challenge and validation suggestions. This is again request for proposals on this, but basically on the mobile part of the third party data gathering, and we'll be participating. I'd like all of you please to take a look at that, because this begins to get real important. They're trying, and they're looking to us to help them in that regard. And the other 2 is the screenshot of the open source that I'd be looking at to work with. It's out of Africa, but it's very good. It's all open source. It's a Koto toolbox, and you'll see the website of that. And then also finally is the open source network. One last thing. Okay. And then I'm going to go, because I did want to mention, all right, but one last thing. Take a look at what's happening at your local PUC with regard to Starlink. So I think the play that they're doing is going to be a real disruptor of the market.
Okay, thank you very much. I actually have a question for you in terms of, in the context of all the discussion, is haven't you developed a methodology for the testing device to use? Because I remember we talked about that.
Yes, I've got
Oh, can you use the microphone so that, because otherwise the audience can't hear.
I've got. Is it
on?
It says green.
Okay.
It's on, right. Well, all right. I've got devices outlined both in the mobile space and the fixed space. So
Okay.
yes.
So that you have actually talked to the FCC about about those devices
Yes.
as a device that works as you described.
Yes, the speed
that
test.
would-
The speed test will just use the FCC
Okay.
one. That's was good and MLabs is good, but Labs back.
Okay.
Sector part.
So
MLabs is good. Is
So
Google.
what I wanted, the point I was wanting us to end with is that we started in the beginning talking about the data analytics that's out there, the social data that's out there that can be added to doing analysis, and that's what Roberto talked about. We went through the critique of the existing the 4 different federal broadband maps. We looked at an example of what can be done in terms of already on the granularity of in terms of looking at households and actually running scenarios of setting up a broadband system. Then we we looked at what can be done, what is being done at the county, at the local level. So we even drop below a state level that's there. And then that raised the issue of crowdsourcing, whether it's the more survey-like crowdsourcing, which Chris Ali has done with counties, which I know have been done in other places to get information, and then to end with on the crowdsourcing part, that if we agree we need to do crowdsourcing for many different reasons. We need to do crowdsourcing to fill in the holes as to what's missing. We see efforts across the board at the county, state, as well as federal level to look at crowdsourcing, but I think particularly at the state and local level, there are crowdsourcing efforts already underway. So part of the point is that if we are going to do crowdsourcing, I think it would be useful to have an agreement on a national standard that Garland has really talked about, and that you seem to have developed the methodology.
It's written specific to the legislation, just the guidepost for the reform effort of maps at the FCC, which is the broadband data, specific to the language there that calls for data transparency, data interoperability, and the fact of the matter is you've got to have a standardized program, otherwise
Right.
the data just, and finally, process. You have to be able to look specifically how these carriers have been able to use the challenge process in the past to make sure that there is no third-party data in there to ground truth and validate the data that they're putting in, and build your model to address the principal ways that they've been effective in the past of knocking out that issue. It is going to be very hard work. It's not going to be, everybody wants to do it quick and easy. They want to do M2M and just throw it up there, and that's what it is. And that isn't going to work. That is not going to work. So as Senator Wicker said, and I've had something to do with both the bill and all this, that's not going to work. So we have to do this thing right. And quite frankly, we owe it to the people who for 10 years have been going to the congressional district meetings of both parties and pounding the table and saying, damn it, listen to us, help us, we want to help ourselves here, but nobody's reaching out and helping us.
Okay, does anyone else on the panel want to add something?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, so I want to just address 2 points. I totally take the point that I think we need to start coming up with a better way to get crowdsourcing data. But it is not just because of ISPs that the FCC does not include crowdsourced data. The FCC is an independent agency that could have made the decision to actually collect this information and to link it on their website to say you are going to a third-party place to get this information and to at least acknowledge that it exists. So I just want to make sure that we are owning responsibility, because the FCC is the agency of jurisdiction with the expertise on this issue. They have traditionally sided with incumbent ISPs to keep that information as proprietary, to select what they were willing to share. And usually when they cite either state, local, or state, county, and local data, it is anecdotal for their purposes. It is not used to inform policy. So I just want to be really clear about the overall power dynamics that are happening here, because we can't solve these issues just in silos, right? Because the issue about broadband data, it's not just about the data. Because even earlier when Paul and Glenn, they were drawing a polygon and saying, deciding on if I'm gonna go into this area, it's gonna cost me this much money per house and this, that, and the other. What happens to all of the people outside of the polygon, right? That issue with all of that polygon is a policy issue about, do they have the right to create their own solutions? So that is a separate issue that cannot be solved in isolation, because it depends on what happens inside of the polygon. So I just want to make sure that we're acknowledging the power dynamics here. This is not just about the numbers and whether or not the agency wants to acknowledge those things. I think the agency, there is a political issue that's at work here, because quite frankly, as long as there's only 4 commissioners, you're going to see them step very lightly about correcting course on things that they haven't done right for the past decade. So I think that it's just important that it takes will as well as the science to get this right. And even after we add that information, also be the political will to keep that information updated and to decide that stakeholders outside of the ones who participate in dockets actually deserve to be heard. So I just want to make sure that that's part of that conversation.
Well,
If I can add to that.
let's take this back to the mapping aspect. And one of the questions that I have is, a lot of this discussion has been on the national map, but we have activity going on at the state and local level. So the question is, should there be state and local broadband maps, which may have advantages of being closer to the broadband realities of consumers? They're the ones who will go to the county commissioner or actually show up at the. So you can, well, we'll take a question in a minute. Does anyone over here want to comment on that?
This is Glenn. I can do a quick.
I would agree. I would love to see more states get involved in, but of course that means you need a much more robust state broadband office partners to make this happen. You know, Illinois has done some amazing work with the Benton Institute. Of course, Georgia, I think, is the leader in that amazing map, working with Lightbox data. Colorado, North Carolina. I mean, I would love to see something like this happen in Virginia, which, you know, again, when we're talking about so much money being at the state level, the states have an accountability, a responsibility to make sure that they're operating on the best data, the most accurate data they can get, and that can be a state broadband office task. Minnesota is another great example of a state broadband office that is really taking leadership in this space. So we can learn a lot at the sub-federal level as to, because states are making it happen in the kind of absence of sometimes some federal leadership.
We have a question over here. I know your hand is up. Can we bring the mic over? Oh.
Hi, it's Adrienne Furness from the Benton Institute, and I actually wanted Roberto to talk about the Broadband Ready program that he's involved with the state of Illinois. Going back to the point about it's not just location data, it's demographic data, it's economic data that should be influencing policy decisions. And what I find elegant about what you're doing there on a regional level is that it is going to be translated into money and policy from the Illinois Broadband Office. So I thought, Roberto, if you could talk about that a little bit, that's such a great model for maybe other states to look at this.
Thank you. Yes, we were fortunate enough to partner with Illinois Broadband Office to conduct these ready programs. The deliverable will be an digital divide elimination plan. It's what they're calling it. And we are innovating in the sense of that we are providing secondary data to these regions, and they are then cross-vetting with local school districts and others that are rural clinics that are gathering this data on their own. And that's something alluded to what we were saying earlier about mapping, is I have seen that at the local level, there is tremendous amount of data available. It's just a matter of how to incorporate that information into and aggregate to the regional and state level functions. But the Illinois project, I think it's innovative in that sense. It's a regional approach, first and foremost. Of course, I'm biased towards regional development, but I think that it will end up being a very important way to address the issue at the regional. We have to pool resources, especially in more rural areas. So stay tuned. We are in the last phase of that project. They should be announcing cohort 1 plans later this year. So thank you for.
Okay, we're out of time. So I know we could go on for probably another couple of hours, which is part of the point of this discussion. I would continue it offline. I'm going to close out and saying on this mapping aspect, for mapping, we are seeking granular, accurate, real-time mapping that captures the dynamic aspect of broadband availability. That can be a supportive tool on the equity side of broadband access, affordability, and use. And I think Roberto has illustrated that point, and it's been raised in the discussion. We are seeking publicly accessible data. The open source aspect of that is parallel to the general open access issues. on a lot of things in broadband and elsewhere. And finally, I'm going to end with this. Why is broadband mapping for infrastructure deployment so important? Beyond all the discussion that we've had, which is really a key point, but I'll make the comparison. They did not build the transcontinental railroad or the interstate highway system without surveying and maps to determine the routes. They didn't, I'm from Sacramento, and they didn't just start laying track going east and sort of discovered that they hit mountains. There was a survey done. But unlike static geographic maps, and this is an important distinction, and I think it's an important distinction you have to make to policymakers, that broadband maps must capture the measurement of a continuously dynamic broadband environment. You've heard that from everyone here. All this data is very dynamic. It's not a fixed geography where you measure and that there you are in the outlines. We have to have standards. So that's where, so we'll conclude with that. And I'll give my thanks to the panel. This is a great discussion. I wish we could go on for another hour or two. And so with that, thank you very much.